Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 34th installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation Webinar Series. I'll be your host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the CEO at Project MedTech. Today, we'll be hearing from Jennifer Saib and Tonya Dowd at PRIA Healthcare for a conversation on why code shopping isn't ideal for your reimbursement strategy. We'll be hearing about or learning about understanding the potential pitfalls of code shopping and how to avoid them, establishing a robust reimbursement plan to maximize the value and market potential of your innovation, and navigating the complex intersection of coding, coverage, and payment to drive success. But first, a few housekeeping slides and some information on Galen Data. Galen Data is an FDA-compliant cloud for medical device manufacturers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. The company is ISO 13485 certified, and the product on AWS is High Trust certified as well. Founded by seasoned medical device professionals, the company's goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off the development timeline. Galen Data allows medical device companies to stay medical device companies and not become IT companies. Finally, some quick logistics. On the right-hand side or bottom or left-hand side, wherever your GoToWebinar control panel is, there is a space where you can submit questions that I will monitor throughout the presentation, and that will ask both Jennifer and Tonya at the end of the presentation. So I'll kind of keep track of them, and if we cover them throughout the presentation, great. If not, we'll ask them at the very end. There's also a handout section in there as well where you can download a Galen Data informational sheet and then also a white paper that Galen Data wrote as well. A reminder that you'll receive a recording of this webinar via email, and feel free to follow up with us should you have any additional questions. With that being said, I'd like to welcome our guests, Tonya and Jennifer, to the Galen Data webinar series. Tonya is the Executive Vice President of Reimbursement, Value Generation, and Market Access. She's an accomplished leader in the healthcare economics, reimbursement, and market access with over 25 years of experience, global experience. Throughout her career, Tonya has held significant leadership positions, driving successful payer partnerships and adoption of new technologies in various medical specialties. Jennifer is a highly experienced Senior Director of Reimbursement, Value Generation, and Market Access, specializing in assisting medical device and pharmaceutical companies with securing reimbursement, government contracts, and market access for their flagship products. She has over 10 years of experience, is a licensed coder and a professional medical auditor, and has held senior positions in payer relations for medical device companies and owned reimbursement support companies for pharmaceutical and biotech companies. With that being said, Tonya and Jennifer, welcome to the Galen Data webinar series, and the floor is all yours.
Dwayne, thank you very much for the great intro, and thank you, Galen, for allowing Jennifer and I to impart this knowledge onto the medical technology community. First of all, just to introduce PRIA. PRIA is a full-service reimbursement, market access, and patient access consulting firm. We do everything from very early stage market assessment planning, commercial planning, pricing planning, reimbursement and market access strategy, payer engagement, and then of course, patient access programs. And we would welcome after this webinar for anybody to reach out if you need assistance in any of those disciplines. We'd be happy to help. I don't want to belabor my background. Dwayne gave a nice overview, so we can maybe go to the next slide. And Jennifer, I do want to say she is a certified coder, so we're going to be doing some presenter dialogue at the end of this presentation, where Jennifer, I will be asking Jennifer questions because she is really the true expert here when it comes to coding. Next slide. So just to reiterate, we will cover the various code sets in the United States, what their purpose is, and who oversees these code sets and establishing these code sets, and how they interrelate to the payment methodologies that exist. We're going to define what CPT code shopping is. You may have never heard of this term code shopping, which is something that we actually kind of made up, if you will. But in really recognizing the need to explain why, again, code shopping should not be your end-all be-all reimbursement strategy, and how code shopping would impact potentially your technology. And just to specify, CPT is a registered trademark of the American Medical Association. I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of that. We have that registered trademark here on the presentation as well. And then thirdly, we're going to identify opportunities and considerations for establishing a unique CPT code, what those requirements are and what that process looks like, and understanding pathways for properly code vetting. So not code shopping, but actually vetting whether or not an existing code is appropriate for your technology, and some helpful resources along the way. And then we'll go through some key takeaways, again, that presenter dialogue, Q&A. And just to, again, specify, the content for this webinar will focus very specifically on CPT code sets. There are multiple code sets in the US, but we're going to focus on, for the sake of time and focus, we're just going to focus on the CPT code set, although we will provide some background on the other code sets. Next slide, please. So before we get into the specifics on coding and CPT coding in particular, we always want to ground ourselves in the fundamentals of reimbursement, and that is coding, payment, and coverage, with the caveat of an underlying pinning of the benefit category. So understanding the benefit category for what your technology will fall into will determine the payment methodologies or the reimbursement methods, the coding parameters that would apply, and the coverage mechanisms that apply. So that is kind of the underpinning of those fundamentals of coding, payment, and coverage that I think everybody is aware of. So what is coding? It's really a numeric or alphanumeric identifier used for procedures, devices, drugs, supplies that are submitted by a provider or a healthcare provider onto a claim to a third-party payer for payment. What is payment? The payment methodology based on the specific payer. So we use Medicare as really a baseline because they are the baseline payment methodology and establish those that other payers refer to. But it's really the amount that is essentially paid to a healthcare provider based on the setting of care and the payer type for that specific benefit category and that specific coding mechanism. And then finally, coverage, which is really critical to understand and how this impacts the technology. Determination of whether a technology, procedure, device, diagnostic, treatment, or drug is medically necessary. So this is a determination by a payer. Is this technology medically necessary or reasonable and necessary for the intended patient population? So again, really having all of these three pieces, the fundamentals of coding, payment, and coverage, is critical, and looking at it holistically is imperative. You can have coding and you can have a payment assignment, but you might not have coverage. And we'll get into that a little bit more later on in the webinar. Next slide, please. So let's look at the US code sets. There are, as I mentioned, 4 different types of code sets that are used in the United States. CPT codes, again, which we're going to focus on today. Those are current procedural terminology codes used for physician professional fees and hospital outpatient facility payment and fees. Then we have HCPCS, Healthcare Common Procedural Coding System for device billing and supplies. And then we have ICD-10, the International Classification of Diseases, ICD-10 diagnosis codes, which identify which diagnosis that applies to a patient. And then we have ICD-10 procedure codes that are used for inpatient hospital procedures. So just kind of looking at the graph here, or the table, we really segment them by the provider type and the setting of care. So you can see for the provider type of physician, inpatient or hospital outpatient department, that's what HOPD stands for, or ASC, ambulatory surgery center, and the setting of care being physician, facility, or facility, that ICD-10 diagnosis code follows through and is applicable in all of those care settings for all of those provider types. When we look at the different types of procedures, we have CPT codes and HCPCS codes that are specific to a physician and in the setting of care of a physician office. Moving to the middle part of the table, we have ICD-10 procedure codes that are specific to an inpatient hospital setting in a facility. And then in the third row, we have, or column, we have CPT and HCPCS both that are applicable for the hospital outpatient department setting and ASC setting, and which defines payment for the facility. So it gets a bit confusing to really look at which code even applies to a specific technology and where they apply in terms of the payment methodology. So this is just important background to really ground the audience here and everyone into the different types of code sets. Next slide, please. So what is code shopping? Again, this is maybe a new term for everyone in the audience, but at its core, it's really focusing the entire reimbursement strategy for your technology on identifying a code only and identifying specifically a CPT code for a new medical technology. Again, it can be a procedure, a new device, a diagnostic, a digital health tool through online platforms. So going on Google and looking up CPT code for your technology or your procedure device that looks into the descriptor that it would describe your technology. Or going on, the new AI kind of chat GPT, looking at what code would be applicable to my specific device. Or talking to some of your physicians, your PIs. Hey, what are you guys using for this technology? Or what are you using for the competitive technology? Maybe it's the predicate device that you are using for your regulatory clearance for your product. What code's being used? Or looking up descriptors in the CPT book. There's actually a CPT book, and there are, of course, online platforms and services that provide coding information. And really looking at the code based solely on the descriptor. So again, looking at does this descriptor that's applied to this code right now really match my technology, or the published Medicare average payment, and without consideration of, again, the holistic strategy. What is my technology's value? What is it bringing to the care continuum for this patient population, to the relevant stakeholders? How much work is required of the physician? Your physicians may actually need to there's a higher amount of skill and stress and work, time in particular, required of the procedure, of your procedure, than what's applied to a current relative value unit. We'll get into that in a minute, but that's valued for a specific code that you've identified on Google that may not be applicable. Looking at your technology's pricing and business model. Don't sell yourself short. If you want a premium price for your technology and it requires more physician work, just because there's an identified code descriptor that looks like it might work for your technology, it's important to really look at that and determine, is this something that I can actually piggyback off of, or do I need to establish my own coding route? And then looking at also reimbursement and compliance rules. This is critical, and we're going to go into this later on in the webinar. But is it applicable? Is this existing code applicable? And what are the compliance rules and reimbursement rules around it? So I have clients oftentimes don't really understand that there are reimbursement rules with using different coding mechanisms, and that impacts ultimately payment. So really looking at that, again, coding, coverage, and payment holistically. And then having really a well-informed reimbursement strategy. And if you take nothing away from this webinar today, remember please one thing, that simply having a code does not guarantee coverage or payment. I mentioned that earlier. You're going to hear me say it now, and you're going to hear me say it later, and Jennifer say it later. But please remember that having a code does not guarantee coverage or payment. Okay, and next slide, please. And this is case in point. This is an excerpt from the CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid manual, that says specifically the fact that a drug, device, procedure, or service is assigned a HCPCS code or a CPT code and a payment rate So remember, there's a CPT code or HCPCS code and a payment rate under either the outpatient payment system or inpatient system does not imply coverage by the Medicare program. So again, having that coverage, coding, and payment, all three working in tandem is critical. So if you have this payment assignment and coding assignment, it indicates only how the product, procedure, or service may be paid if covered by the program. And I can tell you that this isn't just specific to Medicare, this is specific to every single payer entity in the United States, okay?
So Tonya,
Yes.
we've said this several times now, right? Simply having the code does not guarantee payment and coverage. Maybe it would be helpful if you could provide some examples. We could give the group some examples of when we've seen this happen in the real world.
How much time do we have, Jennifer? I know we don't have a lot of, there are several examples. So many, in fact, that's why I say I'm stressing this point so much. But I worked with a technology a few years ago that had you know, a CPT code. It had actually an ICD-10 procedure code because it also had a new technology payment application by CMS, but none of the Medicare contractors covered it in the US, none of them across the country. So that's a great example of a technology that, you know, it was very specific to the Medicare population, had coding assignment for both the physician and for the hospital, but didn't have coverage. So that's one example. But again, there are so many numerous examples. Do you have other examples, Jennifer, that you can share?
Yeah, sure. So my experience in the wound care setting over the past 15 years or so, you know, there are technologies that have come to market that fall underneath a CPT code, particularly in the skin substitute space and the platelet-rich plasma space, which CMS has granted their HCPCS code or CPT code that's for the device and the procedure as well. And then they give them a payment assignment, but the coverage policies under Medicare are all non-covered. So it's very confusing to you know, new innovators that come into the space or even existing manufacturers, because it looks as though you should be able to bill this out on a claim form and it should get its payment, but without that coverage component, it just doesn't work like that. It will get denied every time.
Right. Great examples. Okay. Next slide, please. So let's dig into the oversight bodies for the different US code, the code sets in the US. So, and again, it's important to understand that every single code set has a different oversight body and body that actually establishes and implements these codes. So ICD-10 codes are established by CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services in the US, and the CDC. And again, these describe the diagnosis and patient condition. Moving to the to the right, CPT codes are trademarked, as I mentioned earlier, operated, established by the American Medical Association. And they describe the procedure or the service that's being performed, right? So one example is 27130 here listed. If we look at ICD-10 procedure codes, again, these are two different types of procedure codes. ICD-10 procedure codes are overseen and assigned by CMS. And those, again, are used specifically in the inpatient setting. So here's an example of one with a very long descriptor here on the bottom. And then moving to the far right, HCPCS codes, the Healthcare Common Procedural Coding System, is operated and established. These codes are established by CMS. And again, these describe devices, supplies, durable medical equipment products, and that's an example of one here, C1776. But again, for the purposes of this webinar, we are only focusing on CPT codes. But again, it's important to understand the different bodies that oversee all of these different code sets and the timing and the requirements, right, for all of these different code sets are different. Okay, next slide. So we're going to talk about CPT codes. So what are CPT codes? So let's take a deep dive into current procedural terminology codes. They are a series of numeric codes used for reporting, again, medical services and procedures. They're used by physicians, clinics, as I mentioned, ASCs, hospital outpatient departments, ancillary providers, to achieve and report to payers for hospital outpatient payment. There are currently about 12,000 CPT codes. They are, again, trademarked and owned, if you will, and overseen by the American Medical Association that updates these CPT codes annually. And the AMA has specific criteria for granting new codes or revising existing codes for physician procedures. Next slide. So what are the types of codes? There are essentially 3 different types of CPT codes, kind of going from the top of the list down to the bottom, which is really the holy grail of what everybody wants to get to, is that category 1 CPT code. But let's start with the top. This unlisted codes are really for new and emerging technologies if no other CPT code exists. There's no payment assignment to these CPT codes, and they're really a catch-all, a placeholder, if you will. And every disease area in the CPT book has a specific unlisted code that can be used. So no matter what, if you find that you don't have a code that exists to report your technology, there's always the option of using an unlisted CPT code. They're temporary, but they can again be used immediately. An example is one of us is 76999. Again, they don't have payment, but this can be a temporary code as a placeholder in the interim of establishing your own coding pathway. Category 3 codes, they represent new and emerging technologies, and it's become commonplace that you go to a category 3 code before you go to a category 1. So about 90% of new technologies start, maybe it's even more, start with a category 3 CPT code. You do not have to have FDA clearance or broad utilization, and they are actually often used strategically or even established strategically early in the commercialization process to track cost, to track utilization of a specific technology. So even in the IDE stage, for example, during a clinical study, pre-FDA clearance or approval. There's no payment assignment, and these are assigned, however, every 6 months. An example is 0534T. The T stands for tracking, a tracking code, which is what they used to be called. And then category 1 CPT codes, again, kind of the holy grail. You've made your mark, you are ready for prime time. The technology has society support, it's broadly utilized in the market. Providers are adopting it. The clinical effectiveness is documented. Again, going back to that, is it appropriate for use? That clinical effectiveness and clinical data is important, not only for coverage, but also for coding purposes. So is the clinical effectiveness demonstrated and documented in the published literature? These codes have permanent payment assignment because they go through what's called the RUC process, which we'll go through in a minute. And they are assigned it takes about 24 months, 18 to 24 months to assign category 1 CPT codes because they go through that RUC process, which takes about a year. And an example of one is 63450. So those are the different types of CPT codes. The next slide, please. So who are the players in this CPT ecosystem? This is really important to understand. Besides the AMA, who else plays a role in establishing and pricing CPT codes? You have CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the medical technology industry. You have the American Medical Association editorial panel and the RVS update committee or the RUC committee. And then you have healthcare providers, of course, and specialty societies. Then we go to the next slide and we kind of go through the details of what each of these roles are, or what role each of these key players play in this system, or in this in assigning a CPT code. I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see here. But the AMA editorial panel oversees the maintenance of CPT. They ensure that adherence to specific criteria for code changes and new code assignments is applicable, and they set the uniform language with CPT that accurately describes procedures and medical services. They meet 3 times a year, and these are actually public meetings that the public can attend. Anybody's invited, and they have them in very nice places. So encourage anybody who is embarking on establishing a new CPT code for their technology, or even if you're not, it's important. I tell clients all the time, and I've actually brought clients to CPT meetings. Come and see how it all unfolds, see how this works, see the dialogue, and understand really the political nature of this process. Then you have the AMA RUC committee. They suggest relative value units that are assigned to CPT codes for payment, and we're going to get into the details of that in a minute. But very important group, and they are responsible really for describing the resources and quantifying the resources that are required to provide physician services with CMS in developing relative value units for payment, again, for specific CPT codes. The specialty societies, do not underestimate the important role that the specialty societies play in establishing CPT codes. They are critical. They will make or break a new code, and it's imperative to get them involved very early on, even informing them, even if you don't necessarily need to go down a new CPT route, it's important to inform them that your technology is coming into the foray. Okay, so it's really important to bring them in as partners. But they represent, of course, the specialty societies' respective disease sections in CPT, and they are highly involved, as I mentioned, in the editorial panel and RUC processes. So there's a representative from each of the respective specialty societies that sits on the AMA editorial panel. Okay, so again, they are very, very involved, and somebody that, the entity that should be fully engaged proactively. And then CMS. So CMS, yes, they are part of the CPT process. They fund and manage the physician fee schedule and accept or reject the RUC's recommendations. So again, the RUC assigns or they recommend, after they go through a survey process with specific physicians that would be doing the procedure that's going to be assigned this new CPT code, and they recommend valuations or RVUs for that code to CMS. And CMS can say, yes, we agree, or no, we don't agree. Most of the time they do agree, but they have the ability and authority to disagree. So CMS makes the final determination on what the recommended RVUs are for CPT codes, and they fund and manage also the hospital outpatient prospective payment system, and this is really important, assign CPT codes to payment categories for facility payment. So CMS plays a very significant role, and again, think about it, coding and payment. See how this is interrelated right here. CMS assigns and the RUC assigns payment to these codes. Okay, so remember, coding, payment, and coverage, all very much interrelated. Okay, next slide. So, the CPT codes, again, I'm just going to reiterate this, what their uses are and their interrelation to payment, really important to understand. So we have the CPT code set used in the physician offices for physician services, the management and oversight body, the American Medical Association, the payment methodologies that apply from a Medicare standpoint are the physician fee schedule, which uses relative value units, and the payment oversight agency, the AMA RUC, plus CMS. Moving into the hospital setting, again, CPT code sets. The care setting is the hospital outpatient department or the ambulatory surgery center. The management and oversight body, the AMA. The payment method is the hospital outpatient prospective payment system that uses ambulatory payment classification groups or APCs. And CMS is the actual oversight body there. And we're going to get into the details of how APC payments are determined and how CPT codes are assigned to different APCs in just a moment. Next slide, please. Before we do that, let's break down, I mentioned a lot the relative value units, right? And how they apply to the specific CPT codes for the physician fee schedule. So we're gonna look at, again, it's a bifurcated payment structure. You have the physicians are paid one fee, and then you have the hospitals that are paid under a different payment methodology and different fee structure, okay? But if we look at just the physician fee schedule, CMS's physician fee schedule is based on relative value units assigned to category 1 CPT codes. Remember that category 3 and unlisted CPT codes do not have assigned RVUs. Relative value units will differ based on the setting of care of where that procedure is performed. So in the non-facility, which is a physician office, that would be considered a physician office, not in the hospital or the ASC. If the procedure is performed in a facility, there's a different relative value unit for services that are provided in the hospitals. So if we look at the breakdown of relative value units, there is a relative value unit for work, which describes, again, the amount of time, the amount of skill, and the amount of stress that it takes that physician to perform the service that was represented by that CPT code. There's an RVU for practice expense, and that practice expense is bifurcated by whether or not it's performed in a non-facility or physician office, and a practice expense that's performed in a facility. So if you think about it, if the physician's office is purchasing your technology, there's going to be a higher facility practice expense RVU because they're purchasing the device, the technology, and that should be incorporated and considered in that non-facility practice expense. So the practice expense represents the overhead that's required to perform the service, inclusive also of the staffing, the lighting, the general kind of, leasing, rent, et cetera, in addition to the direct expense of the device or the technology that the physician is purchasing, okay? And then the relative value unit for malpractice expense, which really isn't affected by, or can't be affected necessarily by the RUC, but that malpractice expense there's an RVU for that as well. So these are all these RVUs are added up and multiplied by an annual conversion factor that CMS sets, on an annual basis. And again, there's going to be that's going to be the Medicare base payment or average payment, and there's going to be two different base payments, Medicare average payments, one for the non-facility and one for the facility. So the important thing to understand here with respect to whether or not you need, or maybe if an existing code applies to your technology, is good example is AI or digital health, okay? If you're looking at a code that was established, let's say 10 years ago, again, that sounds like it describes your digital health technology, it should be understood that typically a lot of the physician work is being taken away by that AI component, right? So if there's an RVU for work for the physician, that code is not applicable to your AI technology because there's no physician work, right? Or it typically doesn't match that amount of work that's needed of the physician. So that's just one example of many, but again, just thinking about it that way, and again, really understanding these pieces and fundamentals is a critical component of, again, determining, do I have a code that I can piggyback off of today, or is it necessary for me to go down a new code route? Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to talk about kind of switching gears to the facility payment in the hospital outpatient setting and what that payment methodology looks like.
Sure. So in the hospital outpatient perspectives payment system, which we refer to in an acronym called OPS, OPPS, Tonya mentioned this is how Medicare will establish the payment methodology to reimburse for technologies, devices, procedures that are performed in either the hospital outpatient department setting or in an ambulatory surgical center. So once the payment method is set, another component that relates to this would be the coding, right? So in this setting of care, Medicare will assign what's called an APC, which stands for Ambulatory Payment Classification. That's the main unit of payment underneath the OPPS. So CMS will assign the individual services of the CPT or the HCPCS code to the APC, and it's usually based on having like similar clinical characteristics and similar costs. So both of those factors come together to configure the payment calculation, which would be the rate, the payment rate and the co-payment calculation for these APCs, and it applies to each service or CPT code that's listed within that or assigned into that APC category. Next slide. One of the other components to really factor in here is that there is a lot of rules and other components that go along with codes that are really important in how they're paid and how it's appropriate to use them. Such a rule is to be considered as a status indicator. This will affect how the APC payment is going to be paid and what is appropriate within the OPPS setting, for example. So right now, there is what Medicare assigns every year in their proposed and final rules as a status indicator to each CPT or HCPCS code. This status indicator will identify whether or not the service described by that particular code is paid under OPPS, and if so, whether it will be, if it's separately paid, or is it packaged into an existing payment of a bigger procedure, right? So those status indicators, they're usually assigned by a single letter. For example, status indicator N. Right? N under the OPPS rule would mean that the payment is packaged into a payment for a separately paid service. So for instance, it might be packaged into the bigger surgery or the bigger procedure, the larger procedure that procedure is performed within. There's another status indicator that's important to note, which would be T. That means it's separately paid under the OPPS system. However, there's a multiple procedure payment reduction that will apply when two or more services with this status indicator T are billed on the same date of service. And we'll talk about an example of when this would happen. But these, again, these are published in the rules that CMS releases. The proposed rule just came out this past month in July, and then they finalize those rules with all the payments and the coding assignments for OPPS and the physician's office in the end of October, beginning of November timeframe for the next year that's coming up. Next slide. So here's an example of what we mean by codes that have a multiple procedure reduction attached to it. So if in fact these codes are billed together on the same day, generally what will happen is the claim will pay the highest unit paid amount. So in this example, 93306 would be paid at its full amount. We billed it out at 2,342, but the paid amount or allowable was 242. Now, because there was other codes that when you bill them on the same day, they're subject to this payment reduction rule, like 93925, 93222, 93880, right? They take a reduction in what they're going to pay because, again, they have status indicators assigned by Medicare that says we pay for the first and highest value at 100%, and every other procedure that's billed in addition to this within this list is going to have a reduction of 75% or even up to 50%, depending on that particular code's assignment. Next slide, please. So how should a company go about identifying and validating whether an existing CPT code is appropriate for them and fits their technology, or should we consider other options? Well, there's ways that PRIA obviously has experts to evaluate this, right? But what we would look at is different societies that are the coding expert recognized licensing societies like AAPC and the American Hospital Association, or AHA, that will help to validate whether or not use of a code is appropriate. We will look at special instructions and possibly the vignette or the operative note that describes the procedure and the medical necessity that's going into the procedure itself, and whether or not that matches the procedure that technology performs, right? And their instructions for use, that plays a good big factor into it. As Tonya mentioned earlier, the RVU confirmation that aligns with the technology and the associated procedure and the work involved, especially now that we're looking at digital health and AI, right? That becomes a big factor and component in whether or not that code would be appropriate to use. And then looking at the AMA, it's very important to see what their knowledge base consists of, their feedback and regulations on how codes were assigned and what was appropriate underneath their identification. And again, we have experts at PRIA that can help look at the ecosystem of all of these to evaluate, is there an existing code that makes sense and fits your business model, or should we look at other unique pathways, and what does that look like for coding and what would be appropriate too. Next slide.
Great. These are great options, again, for validating whether or not an existing code would be appropriate for your technology, or if you require really to look further and or proceed with a unique coding mechanism for your technology. So, I think on that note, Jennifer, and I'm going to ask you the questions because you are a certified coder, you're the expert here. What are some implications or considerations that medtech innovators should think about for piggybacking? We call it piggybacking. I identified a code, I went code shopping, I saw something in Google, looks like it describes us. For really piggybacking off of an existing CPT code that looks like it would be appropriate for use for a medtech innovator's technology.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the things that you want to consider, as we talked a lot about, the three pillars that go along with coding, and the other two would be payment and coverage, right? One of the things to consider is just using that CPT code that exists out there. Is there associated coverage policies out there? There might be non-coverage policies for that existing CPT code, that it doesn't make sense to use, this if you're not going to have coverage out the gate with that code. And then, just using codes inappropriately without having vetted through that, a very thorough process of checking with your specialty societies, of looking at the AMA's history on that code, of looking at the vignette and the medical necessity that are appropriate with that attached to that code. You can get punitive measures, or not you, but the providers who use and bill these codes can have punitive measures that they would face. One of them could be that if a specialty society finds out that there's improper use of a code for a technology, they can actually apply for a Category 3 code for that technology, which again has implications attached to it, right? You have to have so much production of clinical evidence, you have to have so much provider adoption, and then there's a timeline that's associated with that Category 3 code. So that could definitely happen. And Tonya, you and I have both seen that happen in our time.
I'm not smiling because I think it's a good thing. It's unfortunate.
It definitely is. And I think on top of that, the punitive damages that could come for a provider billing out inappropriate codes, right? That could be, they face audits by Medicare or the commercial payers, and these could get serious, where you would receive a normalized practice audit every 5 years. If you start overutilizing a code or billing units wrong, or using codes inappropriately together that shouldn't be, you're definitely going to trigger an audit because it's not usual and customary as to what they're supposed to see, and that could cause clawbacks. They could fine the provider, and they could actually take their license and suspend it. So there is some serious implications that you should consider when you want to recommend using an existing code inappropriately.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. I had a client recently that had not gone to the specialty society, went out of the gate with use of an existing code that they thought described them, and it caused so much conflict between the innovator and the society, so much that, to your point about punitive measures, they asked the company to cease and desist, do not have your providers use this code. And subsequently, we had to, really repair that relationship between the innovator and the society, so much that it was actually it ended up being a very good thing, because it caused us to form a positive relationship, and we actually established a category 3 code together, and now they're moving from a 3 to a 1. But it took, there was a lot of backtracking that had to happen, whereas if the company would have went about it, the right way, proactively, and had that strategy established from the get-go, it would have been a better situation.
For sure, 100%.
And I know Dwayne's coming back on, because I think we are at the 15 after mark, and we want to leave some questions, or time for questions and answers.
And Tonya and Jennifer, you can keep going. We had a couple questions come in ahead of time. We've had one come in during the presentation. A few more rolling in now as well. So I'll kick one off here. Best practices for communicating to investors the uncertainty of payment for those looking at an unlisted or category 3 code at market entry. In parentheses, I understood coding and coverage as additional issues, but payment is how an investor calculates their ROI.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I would say that, again, looking holistically, again, not just having the code, because I've worked with numerous new and emerging technologies, early innovators, and VC firms, other investors. And what they want to see is not a code that's thrown up on the screen. They want to understand that you've thought about this process holistically, and you're thinking about the coding, coverage, and payment, and you have a plan in place. Yes, the payment's not going to be there for the enlisted. The payment's not going to be there necessarily for the physician for the category 3, but again, what I said earlier, there is an opportunity to work with CMS to establish a payment in the hospital outpatient department, if it is a technology that's subject to that, under the APC. So really thinking about it strategically. I've had, again, numerous conversations with investors that said, I didn't get the sense that the company really had thought about this thoroughly, and they just threw up a code, and they said, we have a code, that's our reimbursement strategy. That is not enough, I can tell you right now. Jennifer, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I can tell you that the investors oftentimes will come to us as well. After they'll present us with what the company has presented them and say, can you validate this? Because, as Tonya said, they want to ensure that the company's done their due diligence, this is appropriate, and it's going to have a long-term ROI for them, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, and Jennifer and Tonya, just something to add to this too, because we do a lot with startups who are raising money and are in a lot of investor pitches, and this comes up quite a bit. And the really educated medtech investors understand that the code is a piece of this, right? Is one leg of it, and so they understand that. But when you're educating someone who maybe isn't as familiar with the medtech space, it's important to explain to them just value. Take it, if they're going to ask this question, take it one step higher and explain to them the value you're providing to the healthcare system, or to the patient, or to the insurance company, whatever it is. But excellent question there. Another question that was from before was, and again, some of these maybe more generic answers, it'll be hard to give specific ones, but how will a code change if the service is robotically or AI assisted? Can the existing codes be used? How to adapt a code to such a change?
You want to speak to that, Jennifer?
Sure. So I think we touched on this a little throughout the presentation, right? But if you are taking you're entering in AI or robotics to do portions or all of the physician's work. Remember that RVU presentation that Tonya gave on the calculation? That's going to factor into the components that make up the payment level for that code. So if you have the use of a technology like that, using an existing code that has work factored into it and practice expense factored into it that's not appropriately assigned by using that AI or that robot, that's gonna really play a big factor. So it might not make sense to use an existing code. You might want to look at getting a unique, coding assignment for that takes into account the difference in physician work and medical decision making, and then use of that device and the costs that are associated there. I don't know, Tonya, if you have anything else on that.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that, not specific to AI, but the robotic piece, Dwayne. And if you think about Da Vinci, right? Da Vinci, the robotic laparoscopic procedures using Da Vinci are not reimbursed separately. There's no higher reimbursement for using the robot. Your stakeholder then and your value proposition comes to the hospital, right? To articulate the economic and clinical value of using the Da Vinci robot versus just straight laparoscopic. So again, it is not necessarily a new coding play, but looking at the holistic reimbursement and market access strategy is so important. Not just looking at, let's go grab a code or let's go down the new code route. It's not applicable.
Yeah, Tonya, that's spot on. This is an early mistake we see so many companies make, and it goes back to the investor question too, right? These investors, especially sophisticated ones, do not just throw something up there to throw something up there. It's better to be completely transparent with them and let them know that either you are working on a plan or you have a plan, but there's risks in it. And if you communicate that to them up front, it makes for a solid relationship as you go.
Yeah.
Okay, here's we got two more here that came in. How does a medtech innovator engage with the specialty associations?
The specialty societies, we have numerous relationships with numerous specialty societies. I can tell you I've worked with most all of them over the years. And it's a matter of, you can work with us to have access to them. Many of them, depending on the sophistication of the society, will have payment and policy committees. Some of them will have actual specific processes. The AUA, American Urologic Association, for example, has a process whereby they invite industry in to present their technologies and whether or not, kind of really opine on what is the coding strategy and how can AUA be involved. So they're a very advanced society in that regard. Some of them, are not so advanced, but I would say, let's talk through, I'd be happy to help. Let's talk through what is the strategy to engage the society or societies. So there's oftentimes, the case where there's more than one society. And the question then, as it relates to CPT, is who is the lead society that would support the code application? And that's the key. So we can certainly help with that.
Awesome. Another question that came in was how common is it to up code as the basis of a reimbursement strategy? For example, moving from category 4 to 5 of a physical exam primary care because the complexity of diagnosis increased.
You want to take that one, Jennifer?
So look, I always tell my providers when we are looking at the compliance of what they're doing as far as using CPT codes, especially when it comes to the evaluation and management codes for like seeing patients at a patient visit, there are certain factors that they have to hit. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a threshold of what peers in that specific specialty would be billing, like as a usual and customary factor. So if they're going to use like a level 4 versus a level 3 or et cetera, they're moving it up because now the complexity and diagnosis has gone into it. Well, then they have got to meet all of the parameters that are assigned inside that code, meaning there's certain factors within the health history, certain medical decision-making complexities that have to be considered. And then there's, obviously the note-taking and really making sure the documentation supports what they did and why they did it. But they shouldn't be consistently using high-level practice management codes because that will trigger Medicare or the payer to take a look at and start to audit. So if in fact it is an absolute appropriate necessity that they're using these higher level codes, I always say that documentation is what will support you throughout any types of questions that might be raised from that.
Awesome. Another question came in. You stated Category 1 CPT process is 18 to 24 months. How long would you estimate the entire process, initial application for the code, perhaps Category 3 initially, negotiate payments with CMS and major third-party payers, and the parameters for coverage?
Woo, Dwayne, that's a loaded question. What I will say is this: we should talk, whoever answered that question, or asked that question, because there's a lot that goes into, again, I think that strategic approach. But by and large, I will say that the process for, let's just go with category 1 CPT code, the process, that 18 to 24 month that I quoted was just the process of submitting the application, having the society ideally support and submit the application, and it is accepted and it goes through the RUC process. But the work starts earlier on, right? So the work starts either with submission of the category 3 code CPT request, which again, they're assigned every 6 months. But you need to, again, you need to politic with the societies. You need to understand what the strategy is. Completing a CPT code application, category 3 in particular, and category 1 is an art form. It should not be, it is not a check the box. It should be really crafted and thoughtfully crafted, I should say. And having that plan in place early on and understanding that, time frame and what that strategy is, probably requires about 6 months lead time to really, do that partnership with the society, have those discussions, and understand what that plan looks like. But I think, then, negotiating with the commercial payers, that's a whole nother process. And then working with CMS, certainly I can share the time frame. And we have actually, what we do is provide our clients with Gantt charts that goes through the timeline of, okay, here's what we're going to do to get the code. Here's what we're going to do to actually work with CMS to establish an APC assignment, because there is a time frame that you have to follow, because there's a time frame where you kind of a blackout period where you can't converse with CMS, right, during the rulemaking process. So there's some timelines to consider, and we can certainly help with that.
Awesome. So I have one question, and we kind of talked about it beforehand, just curious on your thoughts, but I'm a part of a few different med tech groups that, as things come up, we'll talk about hot subjects, and one of the reimbursement and health economists had dropped a note a couple weeks ago about the physician fee schedule, and it was just a proposal, but the proposal was cutting the conversion factor, the number that you're using to multiply against RVUs to see how much a CPT code pays for, by $1.14 or 3.3%. And so I think it was going from like 33.88 to 32.75. And, just watching some of the comments and not knowing too much about it, I had just said, like, I have a lot of physician friends who just graduated from their residency and fellowships, and they're becoming attendings. And that seemed kind of like a slap in the face to physicians, especially in a time where there's a nursing shortage, there's more physician burnout, right? That sort of thing. But it's only a proposal. But just curious on your thoughts about this. Has it happened in the past? We had barely time to kind of scratch the surface earlier, but just curious on your thoughts and comments on that proposal.
Yeah, I'll give you my comments and I'll turn to Jennifer and get hers. But yes, the CMS issued the proposed physician fee schedule and hospital outpatient system fee schedule a couple of weeks ago. And that, again, as the name suggests, it is a proposed rule. There's a 60-day comment period that is required statutorily. The final rule and considerations coming out, from that comment period will be published in November of this year to be effective in 2024. Yes, there's a reduction. There was a reduction last year for the 2023. It was changed actually in a correction notice. In fact, for 2023, so it was published in 2022 for 2023. But yes, that reduction would mean an overall reduction in the Medicare base payment for the physicians, right? And remember, and I didn't articulate this in detail in the slide, but the base payment consists of 80% of Medicare. So Medicare is paying 80% of that base payment. The other 20% is the Medicare beneficiary's responsibility for the co-insurance. So, but that would be an overall reduction in the actual base payment rate for that CPT code or for CPT codes across the board, right? I would say that we're in this 60-day comment period as we speak. PRIA can help, we're submitting comments. We work with MDMA. We're very close to this. We are submitting comments. We are helping our clients to submit comments on a number of things that were proposed in the rule, this being one of them. But I would recommend that anybody who has interest here submit comments, please. And again, those will be considered. But it is definitely, I would say, like you said, Dwayne, disheartening maybe for some of the physicians, and it continues to be a reduction that we see year over year. But submit the comments for sure. And I think what we may see going forward is a reduction in physicians who participate. And I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but I'm maybe considering that this would be the case where they're not participating in Medicare fee-for-service. So they're participating, however, in Medicare Advantage plans. They're contracted, right, with the commercial plans and payers. But just a guess. Jennifer, what comments do you have on that?
I think you answered that really well, Tonya. It is something that they watch every year, Dwayne, and those comments matter. So to really get in there and put their comments in and why this is, harmful to their profession and what they do and impair their ability to treat patients appropriately, that's what the message that Medicare needs to hear, because they do publish those comments and then they answer those comments. So that would be the way to address it. And as Tonya said, we've seen them change this, right? We've seen them make adjustments and pull it back up. So we'll see what happens in October.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the feedback. It's super helpful, right? I mean, for anyone who reads these kind of things, at first glance, sometimes we don't have a full knowledge of it, right? You almost have like this moment of like, oh, how is this going to affect the rest of everything? And, just coming from my regulatory background, this used to happen all the time with the FDA. They'd release some guidance document and everyone would, be up in arms about it, but it was just a proposal, or it was just a draft guidance, right? It wasn't final. So I appreciate you elaborating on that. Tonya and Jennifer, I really appreciate your time today. Very informative presentation. It was an excellent breakdown of reimbursement. So really appreciate that. For everyone who listened in, thanks for your questions. We will have, I think we actually already have them, so stay tuned for August and September Galen Data Webinar Series dates as well. And thank you so much for joining.
Dwayne, thank you for having us. We really appreciate it. And thank you to the Galen team. Thanks everyone for listening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.